Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this discussion of the French presidential elections here at the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary, University of London. My name is David Klemperer, and I'm a PhD student here at Queen Mary, and I'm very pleased to be chairing today's event. As I'm sure most of you will be aware, France went to the polls the Sunday before last to vote in the first round of its presidential elections. The results saw the almost total collapse of the old mainstream centre-left and centre-right parties, a narrow third place for the populist left-wing candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and the top two places go to the same two candidates who made it through to the runoff last time, incumbent President Emmanuel Macron and far-right leader Marine Le Pen. There will be a debate between Macron and Le Pen tomorrow evening, and this coming Sunday, French voters will be choosing between them. So there is a lot for us to discuss here today in terms of prospects for the runoff and the meaning of the first round results. And to discuss it, we have an extremely well-qualified panel of experts on French politics. First up, we have Julian Jackson, who is an emeritus professor of history here at Queen Mary. We also have Emile Chabal, who is also a professor of French contemporary history at the University of Edinburgh. We have Rainbow Murray, who is a professor of politics, also here at Queen Mary. And last but not least, we have an actual participant in French politics, Laura Slimani, who was active in the Green presidential campaign and is currently an ecologist candidate in the upcoming parliamentary elections. The way this discussion will work is that I'm going to give each panelist 5 to 10 minutes to share their perspective before moving on to a discussion between them and with questions from everyone here in the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat box or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and just type in your question whenever you like so that I can see what questions there are and choose them when we come to that part of the event. Finally, I would just like to thank the American University of Paris's Center for Critical Democracy Studies for supporting and advertising this event, and to say that if you would like to tweet about this event, you can do so using the Mile End Institute's which is at MileEndInst. Without further ado then, I will hand over to our first speaker, Julian Jackson.
Oh, great, thank you very much, David. So we've got a maximum of 10 minutes just to present things. So I'm going to, I should say at the beginning that I'm going to try and analyze rather than predict. Every time I've ever predicted anything about politics, it has always been wrong. I didn't think Brexit would happen. I didn't think Trump would be elected. I thought that Pécresse would do, I thought Bertrand would be the candidate chosen by Les Républicains, and then I thought Pécresse would do well. So my predictions will be disastrous, though I will give it at the end, just so you know that what's not going to happen. But what I'm just going to offer is a series of quite sort of random reflections on what's going on. I think the first thing to say just very quickly is clearly what we're seeing in France is something that's happening all over the world. This is the French version of a kind of new politics that is incarnated by Orbán, by Trump, by Salvini, by Bolsonaro, by Erdogan, by Boris Johnson, and so on. So something is going on. And in some curious way, France was actually, in a way, a sort of a pioneer, because the Front National, this extreme right party, broke through actually very early in 1983. But curiously, in the last 2 or 3 years, France has looked like a sort of oasis of centrist stability. And then we have this election result. There've been a lot of amazement, seemingly, well, not amazement, but shock about the result. But actually, the result is totally expected, the first round result. It's exactly what Macron had planned. And then, of course, we got the arrival of Zemmour, we got the war in Ukraine, which made people think it wasn't going to be as planned. But this is what Macron had been. He's been planning to meet Le Pen a second time ever since the last election. What did we get last Sunday? We got an extraordinary situation of 4 blocks, essentially, 4 equal blocks. We got what we could call an extreme left, an extreme right, a centre, and abstentionists, 25% each, just to simplify. Of course, you could say that when you've got an extreme left of 25% and an extreme right of 25%, they're not extreme. Otherwise, so you could say that what's actually happened is a shift in the whole center of French politics. So what was the extreme right is now the right, and that Macron is not Macron is perhaps the center right, Marine Le Pen is the right, Mélenchon is the left, etc. But whatever happened, we've got 4-4-4. Sorry, we've got 1-1-1, 25%, 25%, 25%. So the big question is what's going to happen, how these votes that didn't go to Macron and Le Pen are going to transfer. The astonishing that has happened in France since 2017 is essentially the collapse of the party system that dominated French politics since 1958, or since a bit later, since the middle of the 60s. So what you have basically in 2017, Macron, who had been within the socialist government of Hollande, stood, and the effect of his standing as a sort of leftist candidate was to destroy the Socialist Party. So in 2017, the candidate of the Socialist Party, Benoît Hamon, got about 6%. That process has gone further, and the Socialist Party got an absolutely historically low vote, and Hidalgo of just about 2%. But this time, Macron has also destroyed the right. He did it through his 5 years in office. What he did was give little gestures to the right to try and split the right, to try and attract members of the rightist party, the Républicains, towards him. And the result is that in 2017, the rightist candidate, François Fillon, got 20%. This time, the rightist candidate, Pécresse, came 5th with under 5%. So what you have is a scorched earth. You have a wasteland. You have a political wasteland, which is in some ways rather reminiscent of the situation in 1958 after de Gaulle came back to power, when essentially the charisma and the power of de Gaulle had destroyed, although the Communist Party remained important, destroyed the French political system. And it took many years before the Socialist Party revived under François Mitterrand. So what we have is not a system of parties now, we have a system of leaders, we have a kind of charismatic politics. There are only three. There is Mélenchon, there is no such thing called La France Insoumise, his party, there is Mélenchon. There is no such thing as Rassemblement National, there is Marine Le Pen. And there is no such thing as La République en Marche, there is Emmanuel Macron. And this is very dangerous, because when you don't have parties, people don't have anchors. They don't have cultural, political, structuring ways of looking at the world. They simply can move randomly, very fast from one thing to the next, because they aren't actually anchored in anything. So this creates an extraordinary instability and makes politics very difficult to read. You can't just say electors will behave like this, because the things that made electors behave as they behaved, parties, have disappeared. A few key dates, I think, in this process, or in the process of the move to the extremes. 1983, the Front National breaks through. A date that I think is really important in French politics is 1992, which was the Maastricht Referendum, the referendum of Maastricht, called by François Mitterrand, which it got through. This was to set up the euro and a very pro-European, it was about Europe, basically. And Mitterrand pushed for this election, for this referendum on Maastricht, and basically the country was divided down the middle. And that's where you first saw this divide that we now have between what you might call a sort of pro-European, liberal, if you want to call it progressive, perhaps that's too loaded a word, and a souverainiste politics, a politics of national defense, of patriotism, of protecting sovereignty, and so on. In the past, now, what is the difference between this second round and last time? Last time, Macron won in the second round relatively easily, and he won because of a phenomenon called in France le Front Républicain, which dates back to the Dreyfus affair and before. That is to say that if people are worried that democracy is in danger, they will rally, as it were, to the person who seems to defend democracy. And that played out in 2002 when Jean-Marie Le Pen got to the second round of the elections, and his opponent Chirac got 80% of the vote in the second round. It played out to some extent in 2017. People were frightened of Marine Le Pen, and so they didn't necessarily like Macron, but they moved to support Macron because they thought she was a threat to democracy. Unfortunately, the situation this Sunday will be different. The Front Républicain classically will not work. Which doesn't mean that Macron won't be elected, but it's going to be much, much closer. Opinion polls obviously show that it's about 45%, 55. But I'm just going to now suggest what's many reasons why we should be concerned if we think that, if we are worried about the arrival of Marine Le Pen to power. One is that, first, Macron is no longer an outsider. He is the insider. He is defending a bilan. He's defending what he's done over 5 years. And he's disappointed a lot of people. And a lot of people really hate him. Hatred, the Gilets jaunes movement showed there is a real hatred of Macron as a representative of a certain kind of metropolitan elite and so on. You should also remember that throughout, there have been, in all the 7 presidents of the Fifth Republic, none has been re-elected, except in a situation of what the French call cohabitation. That is to say, so Mitterrand was re-elected in 1988, but only because for the last 2 years, previous 2 years, he'd been emasculated by the fact that the right was in power. Same happened with Chirac, who was re-elected in 2002 because he had lost control of parliament. So these presidents now seem, as it were, no longer threatening figures and so on. That is not the case with Macron today. The big question is, I'm just worried, conscious of time. The big question is going to be on Sunday, what the Mélenchon vote does. Basically, the votes of the extreme right candidate Zemmour will go to Marine Le Pen. Macron will presumably pick up most, but not all, of the votes of the ecologist Jadot, most of Hidalgo's votes and so on. But then there is a big question, what will the Mélenchon, the left souverainist voters do? And the indications are at the moment, more or less, that their vote will divide 3 ways. There will be about 20% of them will abstain, or will vote for Marine Le Pen. There will be a slightly bigger number that will abstain, and Macron will get about 25%, but maybe less. Why is the Front Républicain not working any longer? Because Marine Le Pen looks less dangerous. She is no less dangerous in my view, and we could talk about that, but she looks less dangerous. She looks less dangerous partly because Éric Zemmour, who was even more right-wing than her, made her look more respectable. That's one reason. Secondly, she's been quite clever. She's hidden some of the most radical parts of her program. If you mention the French people, Marine Le Pen today, they think of cats. She takes selfies of herself in front of cats. She is the sort of friendly, you can trust me. She doesn't talk much about immigration. She talks about purchasing power, about inflation, pouvoir d'achat, and so on. And she is, some of the most controversial of her policies in the last election, such as withdrawal from the euro and so on, have been dropped entirely. And I'll just give you, and I think I will probably end with that now because I think my time is up. I had a conversation with somebody last night in France, the south of France, and what really struck me, and I asked him how he's going to vote, and he said, well, he wasn't going to vote in the second round. He didn't like Marine Le Pen, but he wasn't going to vote. Fine, there are many people like that, and many people, young people who feel disaffected from politics and so on. But what I was most struck by was he said, oh oui, je vais pas voter pour Marine. It's the fact he said Marine, not Marine Le Pen. It's rather like Boris Johnson, who I always refuse to call Boris and should be called Mr. Johnson, makes himself seem cuddly by being Boris. Marine Le Pen has detoxified herself quite successfully. The party is no longer the Front National, it is the Rassemblement National. She is the cuddly lover of cats who is Marine. So I think she is a serious threat. I've finished my time, so if in the discussion, we could come to why I think that she's a threat, and I'm sure others may have already covered that ground before me. Thanks, David. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
No, that's quite all right. I think we will move on now to Emile, who I think has got some slides which might answer some of those questions that Julian has set up. Over to you, Emile.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm going to try to tackle, in some ways, the groundwork that Julian just laid out by deploying some electoral data and some opinion polling data, which I hope will be interesting in terms of my own analysis and the discussion we're about to have. So I'm going to share the screen that I have. Hopefully everybody can see that. Could my fellow panelists just shake their head if they could see? That's great. Fantastic. So what I want to do first, I want to start with geography, and I want to start with geography because basically what I want to do in the next 10 or fewer minutes is answer this question that everybody asks me: can Marine Le Pen win? Now, obviously, in an absolute sense, yes, she can win. There are various different ways in which she could win, but what I want to argue over the next few minutes is firstly that I think it's going to be very difficult for her to win on Sunday. And I'm going to try and explain why that is. And then secondly, I'm going to sort of flip that on its head and say, well, why we shouldn't perhaps be as surprised as we are that she's doing very well. So let's start with electoral mathematics. The map in front of you is a map of the progression of the far right between 2017 in the first round and 2022 in the first round. And if you look at this map and you take this map in isolation and you look at all of the concentrations of red, you might justifiably be rather alarmed, because what this shows is that the far right has progressed pretty universally across a very, very wide range of regions, from the southwest, which was a traditional bastion of the moderate left and of the center, all the way through to the southeast, the Côte d'Azur, which famously is a place which has always had a very strong and robust right. But you can see across rural and urban parts of France a really significant progression of the far right. However, if you drill down a little bit and start looking at this data a little bit more carefully, you can see that maybe this is not quite as comprehensive as it first appears. So here are two more maps in a similar vein. The one on the left shows the progression of Emmanuel Macron's vote in the first round of this presidential election as opposed to 2017. And the map on the right shows the progression of Marine Le Pen's vote. Now, bear in mind, when you look at maps like this, rural areas are overrepresented because they are geographically large, whereas centers of population appear very small. But nevertheless, one of the interesting things you can see here, and I think this is quite important in terms of understanding changing dynamics, is that what Macron has done quite successfully this time around is hoovered up a lot of the votes that went missing for Valérie Pécresse, the center-right candidate. And you can see that particularly in Western France, along the Atlantic coast, and even quite far into Brittany. You can also see Macron making a headway in Eastern France, and generally across rural areas, Macron has tended to perform better this time around than he did before. By contrast, Marine Le Pen's map has much less red, and the only area which is very significant is that the area marked in red there, the Sarthe, was François Fillon's stronghold. So you can see very clearly how she's progressed in that particular constituency. But otherwise, the vote shares remain relatively stable. And actually, it's striking if you look at southeastern France, the Côte d'Azur I was talking to you about a moment ago, that her vote share didn't increase, in some places decreased, in part because Éric Zemmour managed to siphon off some votes in the first round. And what this shows, I think, and this is part of the answer that I want to give about why Marine Le Pen is going to struggle on Sunday, is that Emmanuel Macron has a very, very wide geographical diversity to his support, from rural areas in different parts of France all the way through to large population centers. And I think that remains one of the characteristics of his candidacy and his political movement. Marine Le Pen has her inability to progress as much also reflects the institutional weakness of the party that is hers. So that's one key point. Moving on, another visualization, this time taken from opinion polls. And this, as you've probably worked out, shows the kind of transfer of votes, or what pollsters believe to be the transfer of votes, from the 2017 candidates on the left and the 2022 candidates on the right. Now you can see that most of the three main candidates this time around, Mélenchon, Macron, and Le Pen, most of their votes have transferred pretty solidly across from 2017 to now. However, the big change in this, and Julian alluded to that earlier on, is of course with François Fillon. Valérie Pécresse did very poorly. So where did Fillon's votes go? Well, when you look at this particular visualization, you can see that a good chunk of his votes went to Macron. Some, of course, went to Pécresse. A few went to Le Pen. A few went to Zemmour, and some became, abstentions or vote blanc, as the French, spoiled ballots in English. So what you actually can see here is you can see a reinforcing of the dynamics of the 2017 campaign. So far from 2022 actually marking a significant break in terms of the overall structure and the overall pattern of vote transfers, actually it cements certain tendencies that were very visible. Finally, in this sort of case I'd like to make for why I think Marine Le Pen will struggle on Sunday, here are two further visualizations. In this case, again taken from polling data of, on the left, the socio-economic breakdown of votes by candidate, and on the right, the age breakdown by candidate. And you'll see on the left, in terms of the socio-economic breakdown, a couple of things. Obviously, you can very clearly see that Marine Le Pen and indeed the Front National, or Rassemblement National in general, have become the party and candidate of the working class in France. And this is a very, very marked development in the last 15, 20 years, as the working class vote has been siphoned away from the left and how has come to be crystallized around Marine Le Pen. In an inverse proportion, you can see that Macron does very well amongst the well-educated and amongst affluent sectors of society. Mélenchon, by contrast, scores quite well across all of the different social groups, because on the one hand, he was able to appeal to a working class electorate. On the other hand, he was able to appeal to an overeducated electorate that was potentially economically precarious. So one of the reasons why this is important is that the working class, as in most Western democracies, has the highest abstention rate, and it's very difficult to get them to turn out. In the first round, it was striking that Mélenchon succeeded in mobilizing, in part, electors in some urban parts of France, some depressed urban parts of France. The question is, can Marine Le Pen do the same thing on Sunday? And I think there are a lot of reasons to think that she won't be able to mobilize as successfully as Mélenchon did. And without that kind of mobilization, she's going to find it very difficult to get the core support that she needs. Finally, for the graph on the right, which is to do with age, well, again, there it's fairly predictable. What is really interesting, of course, is that Mélenchon does very, very badly amongst people who are the same age as him. The older you get, the less likely you are to vote for Mélenchon. By contrast, Macron does very well. And here, of course, is another hard reality of the democratic system, that old people vote more, and they are much more reliable voting bloc. And so whereas Marine Le Pen is relying on a relatively younger and more working class electorate, which is less likely to vote, Macron is relying on an older, more educated electorate and more affluent electorate that is more likely to vote on Sunday. So having said all that, I just want to end with one final graph, which gives a slightly longer historical view. And I want to say that although we are not, I think, at a point where Marine Le Pen can successfully break the second round of the presidential election this year, I think we perhaps need to recalibrate our understanding of European politics more generally to incorporate the far right as a major political player. And as Julian said, the French were ahead of the curve to some extent in this. There was already a growing far-right movement before the end of the Cold War in 1989-91, so that kind of key moment in European politics. And since the early 2000s, as you can see on this graph, this represents a first round of presidential election results for the last 5 elections. The far right in different forms, primarily in the form of one of the 2 Le Pens, or in this particular round, this particular electoral cycle, also Eric Zemmour, do score regularly between 15 and 30%. And they do that across a wide range of elections. So here you're only seeing the presidential election, but of course there are other elections too. And I think one of the things that we need to distinguish between is what we might call the institutional normalization of the far right. That is the presence of a significant far right bloc in most European democracies, which is something that's really emerging now, even in places like Spain, that until recently didn't really have much of a far right movement. And also, we need to distinguish that, I think, from what we often call the kind of mainstreaming or ideological normalization of the far right. That is the spread of far right ideas. I am somebody who tends to think that now the far right is normalized and that we should expect a far right at 20 or 25% of most European elections, if they are indeed proportional, but that we can still continue to fight against some of the ideological normalization that seems to have become so rampant in recent years, not just in France, but everywhere else. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Emile. Those are some really interesting charts. Let's move on to Rainbow, who I believe is possibly going to say something about what either of the different outcomes next Sunday could actually mean in practice.
Thank you, David. So I don't have any pretty slides for you, I'm afraid. Instead, I have a crystal ball. So we're going to just look forward a little bit and try to do a whirlwind imagining of what a victory for either candidate would look like. So the first challenge that either candidate would have would be to get not just a victory, but a mandate. So not just to win, but to be able to win in a position that would allow them to govern effectively. And one problem that both candidates would face is how they would unite the people behind them, given that both candidates are disliked by significant proportions of the population, and that many people in this election feel like they're voting against rather than voting for. They're voting for Macron to vote against Le Pen, or they're voting for Le Pen to vote against Macron, something that in fact both candidates have also encouraged the electorate to do. But how do they then persuade people to work with them rather than just defining them by what they stand against? And as a corollary of that, they both would need to get a parliamentary majority if they want to have a real credible prospect of governing effectively. And that is a challenge that both of them will face. It's a challenge that Macron also faced in 2017. He didn't even really have a political party at that point. He had to create one in haste in order to contest parliamentary election, and he succeeded. But whether he'd be able to do so as well this time is more of a question mark. His own party are more disillusioned with him. The electorate are not behind him the way that they were in 2017. And it's an even bigger challenge for Le Pen. I don't think she would be able to get a parliamentary majority for her party. In fact, if anything, I think parties that got squeezed out in the presidential election, the mainstream left, the mainstream right, they still have some power in parliamentary elections. And I think that at that point, people wouldn't feel the need to unite behind Macron to keep her out. I think all the parties could keep her out in different ways in different constituencies. So I think that she would probably not get a parliamentary majority. And without one, she would find it much more difficult to push her legislation through because she wouldn't have a voting bloc. Anything that she introduced via parliament would get vetoed. And so she would need to think about other ways of doing it. And she knows this. It's already in her manifesto. She knows she's probably not going to have any kind of governing majority. So what has she proposed? She's proposed the voice of the people through repeated use of referenda. In fact, she even wants to use a referendum to change the constitution, which is something that is not very credible. The Constitutional Council would be able to block it, but that is her main suggestion really for how to get around her likely impotence as a president without a working majority. And it's also something, one of her flagship policies is to change the constitution in order to legalize discrimination against foreigners. And that is something that she's also likely to find herself being blocked by. So whilst that might be one of the main things she seeks to do, she probably wouldn't be able to do it. In terms of domestic policy, that therefore sort of wipes out a big chunk of Le Pen's pledges, because I simply don't think she'd be able to get them through. I think if Macron was elected, we would see a great deal more consistency with what we've been witnessing for the past 5 years. And we would also see some of the promises he made in 2017, but wasn't able to fulfill due to the pandemic, being carried through to the next term. In terms of the economy, Macron's flagship policy, which was really sort of the state of the art of what not to put on your election manifesto, and he ran with it, is pension reform. He wants to raise the retirement age, currently 62 in France. He wants to push it up to 65. And economically, that makes sense. Electorally, it's disastrous because a lot of people are opposed to it. Telling people that they have to work longer generally doesn't go down well. But if he has enough of a majority behind him, he might yet do it, not least because he hasn't got much to lose this time. If he gets re-elected as a second-term president without necessarily a lasting movement behind him, he might actually be the first president in a long series of those who've tried to actually succeed on that. Whereas what Le Pen is promising is basically welfare chauvinism. Kind of left-wing policies in terms of their economics, but only for the French. And if you're not French, then you're stuffed. So it's that strange combination of sort of socially ultra-right policies mixed with a sort of economic, almost leftism, and promising lots more benefits to the French. In terms of foreign policy, which is on everyone's minds, if we have Macron re-elected, we can expect more of the same, that he will work with NATO. He will want to continue to entrench France's position within the European Union, to which he's very strongly attached. He'll continue to make Brexit difficult for the UK because he doesn't want any other European countries to be tempted to follow in their footsteps. If Le Pen is elected, it'll be a very different story. She's hostile to NATO. She's hostile to the European Union. She likes Brexit because she's hostile to the European Union, but we couldn't expect France to suddenly be our great ally, because she's also hostile to the sort of transatlantic alliance, and her sympathies lie more towards Russia. So I think we would see a much more chaotic foreign policy. Her ability to withdraw from all of France's treaties, I think, would be a great deal more limited, but the tone and direction, I think, would change significantly. In terms of environmental policy, if I've written in my notes, nuclear disaster, not that we're expecting a reactor to blow up on us, but both candidates are in favour of nuclear power. But for Marine Le Pen, that's pretty much it. That's her whole environmental policy. She wants to get rid of wind power. She's not in favour of renewable energy. She doesn't want to stop importing fossil fuels from Russia. Whereas Macron's approach is more mixed. He's happy with nuclear, he's happy with sanctions, and he wants to invest more in renewables. And he's trying to win over the environmentalist votes, which went principally to Mélenchon, also to Jadot. The next thing is, what is their legacy? As we already heard very accurately, I think, from Julian Jackson, these are not party people. These are individuals who have a rather weak party built around them, especially for Macron, who is, you know, he is basically a one-man show with people who've sort of united behind him. But can either of them leave any kind of legacy? I think Macron is going to have to find a way of developing a successor. At the moment, there is no such obvious person in place. Otherwise, his movement dies with him. I think if Le Pen's elected, I confidently anticipate that her presidency would be such a disaster and would be thwarted in so many ways that the electoral viability of her movement would be seriously called into question, to the extent where I've actually heard French voters saying that they no longer care if she wins because they just expect a few years of chaos followed by the death of her movement, and they think that maybe that is more desirable than having this standoff every election and being forced to vote for someone they don't like just to block someone that they were told to be afraid of. And last but not least, can we see a comeback after this election of the left and the right? I thought Emile's final slide, where he showed how that little blue strip of right-wing vote had been completely squeezed between the encroaching yellow of the centre and the dark blue of the far right. Can they bounce back? I think possibly they can. I think they both need to find a strong, charismatic leader, which is something that both sides have been missing. And in particular, I think the left needs to unify, something that they have been dreadful at doing thus far. And they also need Macron to stop trying to eat up both parties and capture that centre space. And I think Macron's ability to do that is likely to weaken over time as he offends voters from both sides. So I think at the moment we are seeing a very strange period in the French party system. I'm not convinced that it's a permanent shift, but I think that's going to be probably the biggest issue to come out of all of this in 5 years' time. Have we permanently changed the French political landscape, or is this going to be a strange era in parentheses between business as usual on either side? And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you very much indeed, Rainbow. So finally, we come on to Laura Slimani. Very keen to hear your perspective as a candidate in the upcoming legislative elections, and as someone who has been involved in the presidential campaign.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure for me to participate in such a panel. I studied in the UK for 2 years, actually, in Cardiff, not in the same university, but I'm always happy to discuss these issues. And I also was chair of the Young European Socialists, so the European perspective and all this is also, I think, pretty interesting. But at the moment, yes, I'm now in the Green movement, and I was supporting Jadot in the last election. I just want to say this, even if I'm not going to have a very partisan vision on what I'll say, but I just want everyone to know it. And yes, I mean, a lot of the points and then the lessons on the political landscape have been made by Julian, Emile, and Rainbow already. So I'm going to go very fast on this and try and be a bit complimentary on the different issues I wanted to address. But as Julian said, I mean, the main aspect of this election is that after destroying the center left, Macron has destroyed now the Conservative Party, or at least its electorate, and has completely taken it for himself. I think that it's not obviously only a one-way street, and he drew on their considerable weakness to do that, and on an increasing disconnection, I think, of these parties with the people, and of the fact that, and especially for the socialists, their inability to embody change for people, and therefore the fact that they turned last time to Macron for this change, and to Mélenchon, and this time mostly towards Mélenchon and to Le Pen as an anti-system candidate, and also as a racist, or at least as a far-right candidate, and all the ideological that goes with it. I think it's also important to remind that it's not only an anti-system candidate, it's also a candidate for far-right ideas, even though they were less present in this campaign than they were maybe in the 2017, for example, campaign. And I think also one of the difference of analysis I would have regarding the 3 blocks or 4 blocks, if you include abstention, which I think we definitely should indeed, but analysis is that I wouldn't say that there is a center, a far right and a far left block. I think, or at least I understand that geometrically you have to see it like this, but politically I think that we can definitely say that Macron is a conservative candidate, maybe a bit more liberal than the Républicain historically, but he is a conservative candidate. So he's, to me, on the right of the political spectrum. Le Pen is extreme right, even if, maybe Zemmour's candidacy kind of pushes her a bit more to the center, or to the traditional right, but she still is far right. But I think that it is a bit of a stretch to qualify Mélenchon as far left. I mean, you said it already, Julian, but I think he's actually embodying the left as a transformative force in this election, and that's why he attracted the electorate of the left. The young people, people from suburban areas, part of the working class, which no parties on the left have been able to do in the past, I don't know, 20 years in France or so. So I think, that's still a point that I wanted to make. And the last point also about this, the 2 last points I wanted to make about this election is a strong disconnection that is really institutionalizing between local elections and national elections in terms of political spectrum. I mean, I am a deputy mayor in my city in Rouen. I think that all of the parties that are represented in the municipal council probably weigh about 10% in these presidential elections, because we have no one from the far right, no one from France Insoumise, and no one from Macron's party in my municipal council, right? And it's a big city, it's over 100,000 inhabitants. So I mean, this disconnection, and it's confirming also, it was confirmed in the last local elections. So I think it's interesting to see how it will develop, and if it will keep that way, or if Macron and La France Insoumise will manage to build also stronger links with local governments, because I think it is still important for their survival. But maybe both systems can also coexist. I mean, I have no idea about this. The last thing also is that there was a very strong system anti-system, I think, analysis that you can make of this election. Macron clearly embodies the system and the people who are winners in the system, and it's very clear from his electorate also in the graphs that you showed, Emile. I mean, older people have very strong ties with Macron politically, and I think that Mélenchon and Le Pen in different ways, but they do carry a strong anti-system discourse, and I think it's also linked to a very strong disconnection, or at least a feeling of a powerlessness of French people regarding democracy that is developing all around the world. But the fact that the system is leaving more and more people aside, the fact that the system is completely unable to tackle climate change, for instance, or social injustice, and the fact that also this system is more and more perceived as an elite that works for themselves and not for the people. So I think that this has also a very this is one of the reasons why the anti-system dynamic is strong in this election, and has been strong in the last one as well. I mean, I'm not going to go too long about Le Pen, because I think Rainbow did it very well before me. Maybe just add that indeed, or stress the climate change issue, that, she, clearly said that it was not a priority for her internationally, that it was not a priority even in her domestic policy. So I think that, this is one of the big dangers of seeing her in power, even though, I'm not sure it's a very strong argument in the election, because Macron's outcome on these topics is very bad as well. France has been condemned by the justice system, for inaction in the face of climate change. So, even if they're not on the same level on this issue, it's not a very strong argument in favor of Macron, even if it is an argument that, we're trying to make as activists to block Le Pen from getting into power. I would also add the strong anti-Muslim stand of Le Pen, in addition to the anti-immigrant stand in general. One of the measures that she's putting forward is a question of forbidding the veil, the scarf, in the whole of public space, and that's a huge breaking point in France. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the boundaries that the Constitution could give us if she was in power, even though indeed it would be difficult for her to get a majority. But I think that the French system, a political system, puts a lot of power in the hands of one person, this person being the president. And with Article 16 plus Article 49.3 and the referendums that she can make, I think it would still, she would probably still be able to move forward, even if, I'm not sure that the system would hinder her this much. And I think also that it's, I really, I know a lot of people think that we would bounce back, from such a terrible situation. I'm not really sure about this. If I look at what's happening in other countries in Europe when the far right is in power, progressive forces don't come back from this in very, very long years, and maybe don't ever come back from this. So I think that that's an argument that I try to put forward as, promoting people to vote for Macron, even if they disagree with his policies. And last but not least, the left and what is going to happen to us, and what we can expect and hope for the future. Of course, this election was a strong, very ambivalent feelings at the end of this election, and I'm trying to be objective in this. A very big disappointment of not qualifying for the second round, even if I think that winning would have been very difficult in any case. But still, you know, it is a disappointment for a lot of people, especially for people who voted for the first time in many, many years and had hope finally. Also, you know, disappointment for me as a green activist, because obviously the fact that climate change has such a small place in the political debates in this election was a disappointment. But I think that we have seen a lot of hope also in this election, and the ability of the left to also conquer new votes, you know, to conquer young people, to go and be something to hope for and to have expectations from. And I think that we hadn't seen this in a long time. Now the question is, will France Insoumise be able to embody or to take up on their role of leadership, basically, that everyone is asking them to have and that they didn't in 2017? I think it's uncertain, but it is possible, more than it was in 2017. I mean, we're seeing a change in perspective and in the position of their leaders, even if, of course, Mélenchon is the leader, but he has built also a sort of leadership around him and of people who are speaking at the moment to the press and to other parties as well. You know, I think it is possible, and I hope it will be possible, because I think it would be able to give us a lot of strength in the parliamentary elections if we could, you know, convince people that it is possible to get a cohabitation government, even if it will be very difficult because the French tend to give a majority to the person they've just elected. But it will still change, you know, if we have 200 left and green people in parliament, then if we have, you know, 50 of them, I mean, it's still a huge difference in terms of also the political debate in France and how we can gain back or you know, have an ideological debate that switches from, you know, only talking about security and immigration and talking more about social justice and climate change, and challenging Macron's government about that. So that's what I'm hoping for, and we'll see what happens next.
Thank you very much, Laura. Julian, did you have your hand up briefly?
Oh, no, sorry, it was a mistake. But I wanted to, I don't know what you're going to do now, but I just wanted to pick up some comments that have been made in the box and so on very quickly. But you may want to run it other ways. It was a mistake.
Okay, I think what we'll do before we come on to some of the comments in the box. So we've got a lot of questions that relate to the future of the party system and some that relate to the far right. I think what I'd like to start by doing is ask some of you to pick up on some of the points that each other have made. So firstly, Laura and Rainbow have disagreed, I think, quite interestingly about the dangers of a Marine Le Pen presidency in terms of her ability to cement control of the French political system. So I was wondering if perhaps Julian and Emile would like to comment on that. And also, Emile made a very interesting comment about the distinction between the normalization of the far right institutionally and the normalization of far right ideas, and suggested that perhaps far right ideas are not as entrenched as the far right itself. And I wonder if the other panelists would perhaps like to comment on that, and maybe think also about the media landscape in France, the rise of CNews and organizations like that have promoted figures like Zemmour. I don't know if Emile and Julian would like to start with the question of the authoritarian threat.
I'll answer your question. I just apologize to everybody here and the panel that I've just messed up my timing and I have to go quite soon. So I will, but I'll just try and answer your question. The one about, I think a very important point was made. I actually can't remember now, both Laura or Rainbow. I think both of you. You raised the referendum issue. It's about institutions. It's very, very important, I think. What Trump showed me is how fragile even institutions one thinks are robust are not. America, you know, the French Constitution has been there since 1958. The American Constitution has been there since the 1770s. They are very fragile things. Now, to be a bit nerdish about this, because I think it's important, there are two ways that you can have a referendum in France on constitutional reform, because quite rightly, it's been said by Rainbow, and there's a question by Robert Saunders in the box about this, that if you don't get a parliamentary majority, how are you going to do anything? You're going to go to the people, and that is Le Pen, that is her thing. Now, there are two ways, and she basically wants to change the constitution to discriminate against foreigners effectively. Now, there are two ways you can do it. there's Article 18. The way you should reform the constitution by the referendum is you first put it to Parliament. Parliament says, yes, this is something that can be put to a referendum, and then a referendum happens. That is the way you are supposed to amend the constitution in the Fifth Republic, Article 89. However, you can call a referendum by Article 11 on non-constitutional subjects. Now, unfortunately for all of us, de Gaulle, ignored his own constitution. And twice de Gaulle, in 1962 and 1969, used Article 11 to push through constitutional reform. That was illegal by his own constitution. The Conseil d'Etat told him in 1962, and he said, to hell with the constitution, it's my constitution, I'll do what I want. Because he was de Gaulle, he could kind of get away with it. He failed in 1969 and he then left power. Now that is an amazingly important precedent for Marine Le Pen to use. Although there is now the Conseil Constitutionnel, which is much more powerful than it was in 62, I could just imagine her in a debate with Macron. He says it's illegal, she says, de Gaulle did it, I can do it. So I'm not confident about the robustness of the institutions. And I think that elected, she could, do, that they are much more sort of fragile than we would think. And just the other point that was made by David's question and so on, and it's in one of the boxes, and I think it's a very important point. What is the extreme right? What do we mean by the term extreme right? There is no essentialist right or essentialist left. These are always contingent things in political systems. And what we are seeing now, I quite agree with Laura when she said, Mélenchon is probably not the extreme left. Mélenchon is the left. He's capturing a lot of people who might have voted ecologists and might have voted socialists who are now voting for him. But where you've got what we see is what you would call the banalisation, the banalization, the normalization of things that would have been unacceptable, impossible to conceive. Just think of Zemmour, the fact that Zemmour got 7% of the vote for the most extraordinary policies, that he was supported by Le Figaro, that he was supported by a number of mainstream French channels, or sort of not totally mainstream, but important French television channels, shows that something has shifted. So the extreme right is no longer possibly the extreme right. And so my final point, because it just picks up something in a box, what will the future bring? I personally think that Marine Le Pen will not win on Sunday, though I think it's quite possible for all the reasons have been put. I think she won't, but somebody put a question in the box, what about the future? And I'm afraid the future is Marion Maréchal Le Pen, that is to say her niece, who is an extremer version of her aunt and is very charismatic and is more intelligent. And that is, I fear, the future. So I see this Sunday as just another 5 years holding the barrier against what I fear is going to happen. So anyway, but and if I just disappear, I'm sorry, it's just because I have to, but I just want to make this point.
Thank you very much. Laura, would you like to come in on this question of the normalization of far-right ideas and Zemmour and Marion Maréchal Le Pen? Is she the future?
Yes, I mean, I think I also wanted to make a point about the fact that there is a bit of a paradox in this election, in the fact that it's one of the presidential elections where we have spoken the least of the question of immigration in a very long time in France. And when we have spoken about it, it was rather about refugees from Ukraine, so in a more positive way, in a sense. And despite this, the far right chunk of the vote has, grown quite significantly if you include Zemmour, which you have to include, obviously. So, I mean, and probably because of this, actually, because Zemmour has concentrated this racist French vote that exists, and Marine Le Pen has kept on expanding her anti-system, position in the political spectrum, but still, with a very, very strong, xenophobic platform. And so I think that this also reflects on very strong ideological of the very big ideological strength of the far right in France, in the media, indeed, with a political line, a political stand of some very big and watched media like CNews that is what would have seemed completely outrageous 10 or 15 years ago, and that is now completely mainstream, you know. And indeed, you know, with some newspapers that, you know, like Le Figaro, etc., who have given a lot of sway, a lot of power to candidates like Zemmour. And I also think that if Marine Le Pen would get into power, I think that it would also give them a lot of ideological power in defining the political agenda, in pushing forward this ideological agenda.
Thank you. Rainbow and then Emile, could I ask you to very briefly comment on these points about the far right, and then we'll move on to some of the questions about the future of the party system that we have from Tony and Rob and Richard. But yes, Rainbow first on these points about Le Pen.
Thank you. I want to clarify, first of all, that I don't think I'm particularly opposed to the viewpoints of Laura. In fact, I agree with a great deal of what she said, and also with what Julian said. I don't think that institutions have entirely the power to neutralise Le Pen and to block everything that she wishes to do. I do think they are robust to a certain degree. And even if you look at the USA, which Julian Jackson cited, there we had a president who had, he was the candidate of one of the two mainstream parties, which isn't the case in France. He effectively had a parliamentary majority in America. And even then, a lot of what he wanted to do was blocked, and his ultimate goal, which was to usurp power indefinitely, was vetoed. And then politics did return to a degree of normality. So I think without some of those benefits, I think it is going to make it much more difficult for her to achieve a lot of the things she wants to do, because it's not only that the institutions exist, but also it's about who sits within those institutions. And I think the people within those institutions have the will to resist. But I think we shouldn't downplay the symbolic importance of a Le Pen presidency. Even if her laws don't all come to pass, the symbolic power of a president spouting hate speech. And let's be clear, that is what she's doing. She's spouting hate speech. She's spouting hate speech against foreigners. She's spouting hate speech against Muslims. She has few kind words to say to the LGBT community, for example. That hurts. It can do real damage. It can obviously hurt the members of those communities, but it can also affect a cultural shift within the electorate themselves. We've already seen how some of the radical discourses of Eric Zemmour made it possible to say things that had previously been unacceptable, and it normalized these kinds of discourses, and that can have a terribly disenfranchising effect on members of those communities. So I don't want to downplay the severity of a Le Pen presidency, irrespective of what she actually manages to achieve from a constitutional or legislative perspective.
Emile?
So I don't want to repeat what everybody else has said. All the points are very valuable and important. The only thing I would say, and here I'm really putting my historian's hat on rather than looking like a quantitative data man, which I'm really not. I just like electoral maps. One of the striking things about French political culture is a very, very deep fear of social disorder and social collapse. And that's something that is a little bit unusual to France. I don't think you find the same thing at all in the UK. But one of the consequences of that, and this is born out of a very tumultuous modern history that is not just tumultuous in the events, but also in the memory of those events, that has continued through the 20th and the 21st century to percolate. And one of the consequences of that is that radical change has very rarely taken place through the ballot box in France. And if you look at the kind of electoral map of the 20th century, on only 3 occasions have the French voted for self-proclaimed socialists: in 1936, 1931, and obviously in 2012. And that's, if you think about socialism and communism representing a different form of radical change in different historical contexts, you can see just how remarkable those 3 moments were for various different reasons, and how difficult I think it would be for Marine Le Pen to achieve that kind of breakthrough, given that in her case, the institutionalization of her movement is much less than the institutionalization of the left in either of these three periods, in the 30s, in the 80s, or in the 2010s. So I think there is one of the consequences of the two-round electoral system is that when the French are faced in the second round of the presidential elections, having had 2 weeks to think about it, with the prospect of the disorder of the kind that Rainbow, I think, was describing, you know, potentially gridlock parliament, immediate protests. I have no doubt, for instance, that the French civil society would react to a Le Pen victory, and that would come out into the streets, and that would be violent, because these things are usually violent. I think the prospect of that sort of social disorder is probably going to be enough to keep people on the straight and narrow voting for Macron. And I think that's a really important historical path dependency of the French political system, which I don't think you can say about other European countries. That's all.
All right, so we've got a lot of questions about the sort of future of the party system. You know, Richard Johnson is asking, you know, which parties are going to do well in the assembly elections. We have Robert Saunders and Tony McNulty asking about the continued strength of the sort of older parties at the local and parliamentary level. So sort of to try and sort of take some of those questions together, I suppose, you know, we've also had Julian talk about the party system looking like it did in 1958, where we just have leaders without parties. So I suppose the two questions I'd like to ask, you know, our three remaining panelists are, do we think these leaders, Le Pen, Macron, Mélenchon, are going to be able to build real forces around them, like, you know, the leaders of the early Fifth Republic did, de Gaulle and Mitterrand? Could we be seeing new kinds of parties emerge? Or are the old parties going to continue to play an important role? And just to pick up on something that Rainbow and Laura disagreed on, again, and I think Emile slightly as well, how much is the defeat of the old parties a product of Macron coming in and destroying them, and how much is it their own doing? If Macron were to, you know, be removed from the scene, would they come back? So on those general questions, Laura, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I can, but I think I've forgotten half of the questions, so pardon me.
That was very not really coherent for me.
But I yes, on the first issue of is Macron really responsible for the Républicains being so low and the Socialist Party? I mean, I don't know the Républicains Party enough, you know, deeply enough to have a very strong opinion about it. I think that ideologically, he basically led policies that were exactly the same that what they would have done. And he also, I mean, minus some of the most conservative aspects of the Conservative Party, you know, I think he was still a liberal in some of his policies, even if the actual progressive changes he put forward were very limited. But I would say that PMH, I can't remember the name in English, assisted procreation for women. He enlarged it to all women, which was, you know, something that Hollande didn't do, and he did it during his mandate. So on women's rights, etc. Even if he didn't go that far, but I mean, they were, you know, the discourse at least was progressive on these issues. But I think that he also took a lot of their ministers, and he built on some of the divisions and on a non-resolved discussion within the right of how solvable are we in the far right, how far to the right must we go, you know, regarding Marine Le Pen. So I think Marine Le Pen has had a very strong role in weakening them, and then Macron kind of came in and destroyed what was left of it. And regarding the socialists, I think it's a bit of a different issue, because I would say that Hollande's election was a bit of a trompe-l'oeil, in the sense that it was an election that, you know, we won, and left didn't win a lot of elections under the Fifth Republic, but under a very social democratic center-left position, and with a government that disappointed very deeply the French people. But that was, you know, that was also linked to the fact that the Socialist Party was not anymore ideologically a party of change, I think. And so I think that basically it was very easy for Macron to come in and kind of swipe the major part of the the socialist electorate in 2017. So I think it's a deeper issue, and even though they have very strong links or strong holds at the local level, and they will probably keep them for a while, I think it's a party that is gradually going to die. But I could be wrong, and in Europe, I mean, there are still very strong social democratic parties, but I don't think that social democratic parties in Europe that have come so low to such low levels of support in societies have ever bounced back. If you look at PASOK, I mean, for example, but also in a lot of the Eastern European countries, on this question specifically. Oh, and maybe on the other points, I mean, I really don't remember them, but I think there was a question that maybe I wanted to answer if you're okay about COVID and the impact of COVID on the election, because I think it's quite interesting. I think that it had a positive impact on Macron's score. I think that he was very far from having before COVID, the levels of support of Macron were not high, and especially at the beginning of the COVID crisis, I mean, the management of the crisis by the government was so chaotic that the levels of support of the government really dropped. But during the crisis, I mean, he kind of he gained a lot of credit in the way that they managed the following parts of the crisis in a very clever way, I think, strategically. I'm not talking about health-wise, but more like in a strategic political way. And so I think he gained a lot of support, especially regarding older people at that point, and especially regarding the fear of social disorder, etc., that you were talking about, Emile. And on the contrary, it's interesting to see how both Mélenchon and Le Pen used COVID as an anti-Macron argument very strongly regarding the pass sanitaire, regarding how he treated the workers in hospitals. I mean, there was a very anti-Macron, anti-vax for part of the far right as well position that they built. And I was looking at the social network earlier, and it's a very, very strong argument for the anti-Macron vote on social networks at the moment. So, yeah.
I wonder if Emile or Rainbow would like to sort of address the question about the persistence of the old parties at the local and regional level, and what that says about the future of French politics. Rainbow?
Thank you. I might do a quick blitzkrieg of the questions, if you'll forgive. I'll try and take them really fast. How robust do the parties remain at parliamentary local level? Much stronger than at the presidential level. So yes, I do think there's a possibility for revival. I think the parties are not quite as dead as the presidential scores would suggest. Is it likely the chunk of Mélenchon votes will switch to Le Pen? A chunk of it will, probably not a large chunk. I think a bigger chunk at the moment is going to abstention to Le Pen. And Mélenchon encouraged that as well, told people not to vote for Le Pen. Would Mitterrand be dismayed at the score of the Socialist Party or find it funny? I don't know, but I found the question funny. If Macron loses, who could take his place in the share of the votes? I think it will bleed back out into the moderate left and the moderate right in the parliamentary elections. If Le Pen loses, I think it depends whether she loses badly or loses well. If she loses well, which is to say that she kind of did better than last time, I think she can put this down to a sort of long-term build of momentum. If she loses badly and does worse than last time, I think that the far right may start looking for a new leader. And I think then the future, as Julian said, may well be Marion Maréchal Le Pen. Could it be an advantage for Le Pen to have her hands tied by Parliament? I don't think so. I think it will just make her look like a weak leader. I don't think the French would blame Parliament for blocking her. I think the majority of the French would probably be relieved about that because she still doesn't have a majority of support in the French population, even if people don't like Macron. Would the National Assembly elections reflect this election or last year's? Bit of both. So the forces that we see in regional elections are also reflected to some extent in parliamentary elections, but it's also about whether people will feel the need to give the president a working majority or not. Is it still accurate to refer to Le Pen as far right? I would say yes, it still is, especially when you look at her attitudes towards immigration. She might not have talked about it as much for strategic reasons, but it's still there and it's still as radical as ever. As there's no obvious successors, what will the 2027 presidential election look like? My crystal ball doesn't go that far. In 2012, nobody saw the emergence of Macron and the collapse of the socialists in 2017. In 2017, no one saw the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So in 2022, I have no idea what the next 5 years are going to bring. Could we see all of them disappear by the next election? Yes, that's definitely possible, but no guarantees. I think Laura's already answered COVID, so I'll stop there.
That's a brilliant blitz. Thank you so much. Emile, do you want to come in and say something about the future of the party system?
I'm really impressed with the way you scythed through those questions for Rainbow. That was quite a masterclass. I'm just going to stop and pontificate rather than go through any questions, but about this issue of parties. So I mean, depending on how well you follow French politics, you may or may not know that historically parties in France are exceptionally weak compared to other European and indeed global democratic systems. And this goes back to the 19th century, and there are good historical reasons why parties as intermediary bodies in the kind of representative structure of the different republics from the 1870 onwards have been historically very weak. And you can see that quite clearly in recent years in the way that parties change their names, they change their personnel, they change their branding. In fact, the two longest standing parties in French politics at the moment, apart from the French Communist Party, who are a little bit special, are the Parti Socialiste and the Front National, which of course has recently been renamed the Rassemblement National. Both of those parties were born at basically the same time in the early 1970s. So that's not that long ago. So the question about parties is whether you think a strong party system in the French context is the norm, or weak party system is the norm. If you go and look at the early Fifth Republic, that is the 1960s, it's very clear that what you have is a weak party system. The strongest and most coherent party at that moment is the French Communist Party, which by the 1960s is hemorrhaging electoral support and well on the way to becoming a kind of third-tier party. All the other major parties are either in serious decline, or they are essentially parties around a person. In the case of de Gaulle, it's the Gaullist Party, which again changes its name many times. So the only period really when you have a classic bipolar political system runs from roughly the late 1970s through to the late 2000s, right? And that's a period when you have a recognizable left bloc around the Parti Socialiste with bits that detach and reattach at different points, and you have a recognizable right bloc which changes its name several times in that period. But that's the period of bipolarity. So the question is, now, if we're seeing a decline of the party system, and I would agree actually with Rainbow that there's quite a lot of strength to that party system at a local and municipal level, and Laura, you said that as well in terms of municipal campaigns and so on. There's a lot of mobilizing power for these traditional parties. But if indeed we are seeing a kind of permanent decline of those parties, then that may actually be a return to the norm in the French context, rather than some sort of radical departure from the norm. And I think the difficulty is that we tend to compare France with neighboring democracies like Germany or like the UK, which have, again, for good historic reasons, extremely strong, well-institutionalized parties. But it might actually be useful to compare France with Italy, where there was a complete collapse of the entire political system in the 1990s and a reformulation of that. And now we live in a sort of post-party world in Italy, where you have movements that pop up and appear and disappear, and you have technocratic governments on. I don't think France is at all at that kind of level of instability, but it may be more useful to see Italy as a reference point rather than to see the UK or Germany as a reference point if we're thinking about parties.
Laura, do you want to come in on that briefly?
Yes, I wanted to actually comment on two questions that I've seen in the chat and I didn't answer. The first one being, what are the parties that are going to do well in the parliamentary elections? And it's the parliamentary election is a bit of a weird election because it's constituency by constituency, so it has a local dimension to it, but it's also a very national election in terms of the debate is national, and it's right after the presidential election, so the stakes are definitely national. But campaigns play a bigger role the implantation, the fame of this and that candidate play a little bit of a bigger role. And it's not impossible to see a little bit of change in the dynamics, even though it's more likely that the parties that were strong in the presidential election will also be strong in the parliamentary elections. But, in some places, because there is a local kind of specificity, it can also give a bit more strength to the Socialist Party, the Greens, or the Républicains also, and especially where they have a kind of outgoing candidates which have like a credit, that they can run on also. And yes, I wanted to also answer a question about créolisation and how, if this concept that was put in the political debate by Mélenchon, was played a positive role in his campaign. I think that it was a very clever way of kind of reuniting part of the French, and especially in the left, on this question of identity, race, and which is also a complicated question for the left in France. In the opposition between this kind of universalist vision of things or a more diversity-oriented intersectional vision of equality and of this question of equality. And I think that in this créolisation kind of concept, he managed to talk universally about a complex question for the left. And also I think that more generally, the fact that he tackled the questions of racism, of feminism, of women's rights, of environment also, and different kind of societal issues was also something that the left traditionally doesn't do as much, I think, in elections, even though it is, I think, increasingly among young people, and it also, I think, explains part of the young people's votes, are attractive issues that are important for them, and that I think we need to tackle more. The left needs to tackle more in a more modern way, or in a way that is appropriate, or that is that kind of corresponds to the way young people also view these issues as, and these different forms of oppressions and dominations as important in their political engagement.
So, Laura, if I could follow up on that, is the future of the French left Mélenchoniste?
I think it's difficult for Mélenchon alone to be the future of the French left, because there is also a left in France that is very that is liberal in a way, in the kind of the proper way, or and the issues that we have faced regarding the relationship to Russia, the relationship to democracy, to democratic principles. I think there is still a difference, and Jadot and Hidalgo together is 6%, and I think Macron still has some of the votes of people who have voted for the left in the past. And to have a majority in France, we need to kind of also talk to this more moderate left and include it in this project, or this new kind of project that we have for France. So I think he still has a bit of work to kind of create, to get more allies around him. And I think it's what was the most disappointing and the most cruel also in this election is that if Mélenchon had as many allies as he had in 2017, that is to say, if the Communist Party was with him in this election, he would have probably been in the second round, right? If you look at the levels of the Communist Party, because it was 400,000 votes that were missing, so it was nothing, but in the end, for reasons linked to, for many reasons, but he didn't manage that. And it's, even if probably the Communist Party has a responsibility to it, but when you're the biggest party on the left, on the right, or wherever, it's your responsibility to create alliances that allow you to conquer power, to get a majority. Basically, you have the responsibility of the majority, and he didn't succeed in this. And I think that maybe in the parliamentary elections, he puts one step again forward towards this direction. It could be the key to something a bit different, maybe.
Emile?
Yeah, on Mélenchon and créolisation and these sorts of things, I think it's interesting. I don't see how Mélenchon can be the future of the French left, in part because he's so much the past of the French left. Mélenchon's main project politically for the last 15 or so years has been to destroy the French Socialist Party, and he has achieved that. It's not just him, of course, but he has achieved the sort of institutional gutting of this party at a national level. But the problem with this electoral cycle, and I've joined Laura in this, the problem with this electoral cycle was that Mélenchon almost realized too late that he had become actually the repository of a much wider coalition of left-wing voters, even than in 2017, and certainly than before that. And so in a way, his electorate were one step ahead of him. They created the Union Populaire that was supposed to be what his campaign was about. There were many people who voted for him, I think, who didn't like him as a person and found him as a personality very, very divisive. And you can see by some of the electoral or the opinion poll data that I put up earlier on that he's disliked amongst really core constituencies, particularly amongst older people, which you'd think is counterintuitive, given that he is an old man who likes to talk at great lengths and give long speeches and, you know, sound off about things. You would have thought that this would appeal to a larger chunk of that aged electorate, as it were, than he actually does. And what I think is interesting, though, is that there may be signs here of a kind of bounce back mobilization of the left, which if you look back at 2002, for instance, and the reaction to 2002 and 2007, where the far right fell quite sharply as a result of Jean-Marie Le Pen getting through the second round in 2002, there was a kind of stronger mobilization on the left. It didn't bring the left to power until 2012, but there was a sort of concentration of mobilization. And I think what you saw in this campaign, which was a bit unexpected, and it was difficult to read in the polls, was this mobilization amongst the so-called quartiers populaires, particularly around Paris, but also in places like Marseille. And actually, when those electoral blocks do mobilize, even in quite small numbers, there are so many of them that it can make a really big difference. And that's what took Mélenchon from 20% or 19% to 22% and almost got him over the line. So I think that's in a sense where the future of the left will depend, is on a candidate who can continue to mobilize those people, while also reaching out as the Macron project comes to an end, reaching out to those voters who will have nowhere else to go. But I do think that the left didn't perform very well in this election overall. 30%, essentially 30% of the vote, if you look at it, is not a very good performance historically for the left. So I do think that Mélenchon's performance slightly flattered the left and gave the left hope that perhaps was not warranted. Finally, on Mitterrand, the Socialist Party, it's a great question. I think he would have been appalled, but mostly because the communist candidate did better than the socialist candidate for the first time in half a century. And Mitterrand's entire project was about consigning the communists to a second rank partner of the Socialist Party. So I think he would have been appalled to see Roussel come ahead of Hidalgo.
All right, we've got very little time left indeed. So I wonder if Rainbow and then Laura would each like to give about 90 seconds sort of final thing to say.
I'd like to clarify that Mélenchon got 22% of the vote. He didn't have 22% of French people supporting him. There's a difference. If you look at the opinion polls up until about a month before the election, he was polling about 10-11%, and the left-wing vote was much more evenly split across 5 or 6 different candidates. And it was only in the final weeks where there was a surge towards Mélenchon, not because people suddenly started agreeing with him, as Emile rightly said, a lot of them still agree with him quite fundamentally, but just because they were desperate to get into the second round, and they realised that as long as they remained hopelessly divided, they were just handing the election over to Macron and Le Pen. So this became a tactical vote towards Mélenchon. But if you actually look at the left-wing vote, it's much more widely distributed across the political spectrum. So I think in a post-Macron world, which we are going to be facing at the very latest in 2027, you could see a resurgence of a more mainstream party of the left. And if they could unite that vote behind them, then we could credibly see a comeback of the left at the next election.
Thank you very much. Laura, any final comment before we let everyone go?
Yeah, just maybe to talk about climate change and the Greens and how maybe we can be useful to the left being able to build majorities in France. I mean, I think that this election has shown quite clearly that the electorate of Jadot is much closer to that of Macron than Mélenchon's. And I think it's a bridge that is also the question of climate change, which is, becoming increasingly a very central question in the political debate. And so the question is how we as an organization also, we manage to organize, to structure, to work ideologically, politically, and to ally maybe around people, maybe not Mélenchon himself, but, if the movement keeps after him or with him in the next few years, try and build the coalition that is able to build a majority. So I think that's anyway what I think it's exciting. It's not only sad and disappointing for me. It's also an exciting, maybe the first time in years that we've seen some excitement around the left in France, and that's something to look forward to.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think we will wrap things up. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for speaking to us this evening. Thank you to everyone who came along and asked a question. You can find out more about the Mile End Institute at qmul.ac.uk/MEI, where you can sign up to the mailing list and find out about future events. Thank you all so much. Have a very nice evening.